to give a shout out for midges, because without midges we wouldn't have chocolate, because the cocoa plant is pollinated by little non-biting midges.
Welcome to our latest Hutton Highlights podcast. I'm Elaine Maslin, Media Officer here at the James Hutton Institute. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by one of my colleagues and two of our campus partners here at our Craigie Buckler site in Aberdeen. They're here with me in our beautiful grounds to talk about pollinators, the fantastic range of creatures that often go overlooked, but without which we'd not have many of our flowering plants, including many of the food crops that we eat. We'll learn a bit more about some of the important and maybe not so well-known roles they play in a bit. But importantly, we're going to talk through some of the things you can do to help support pollinators. That includes a bit of discussion about Nomo May and a few other bugbears our guests have when it comes to pollinators. But first, before we meet our human guests, we're going to meet some pollinator guests we have here at the Hutton grounds. With me is Dr. Jenni Stockan, an expert in insect ecology and conservation here at the Hutton, to tell us who they are.
So we're in our arboretum in the grounds of the Institute, which is lots of tall trees and grassy understory, which you wouldn't think at first glance would be a very good pollinator habitat. But actually what we have here is a lot of good nesting sites. So in our sequoias, we're just standing by one of our really tall sequoia trees, which has got lots of nooks and crannies in the bark. And we've got tree bumblebees nesting in this tree. These are the only bumblebee we have which nest above ground. So they'll nest in the eaves of buildings, in bird boxes, and in trees like this one. This is a recent colonist to the UK, so it only appeared about 20 years ago, and it's been slowly moving north, and it appeared in Aberdeen about 2017. So it's only been here a few years. We've also got a lot of mason wasps in the grounds as well. These are solitary bees, so they're nesting in some of our tree stumps, and they would nest in walls and hollow bits of plants as well. They only have one generation a year, so the female will create a little cell in the wood. She will plug it at one end with a bit of clay. She'll then lay an egg, provision the cell with some paralysed caterpillars. She'll then close it up and the egg will hatch, grub will feed away on the caterpillars, and then it will pupate and emerge next year as an adult wasp.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Jenni. So now we've met our insect residents, let's turn to our campus partners here in Craigie Buckler. I've got Rose Toney, an ecologist and community development officer at North East Scotland Climate Action Network, that's NESCAN for short, and Abbi Ferrar, coordinator of the North East Scotland Biodiversity Partnership, or NESBiP. We've got you here to talk about what we can do to support our pollinators. But before we dive into some of the practical things people can do to support pollinators, first, Jenni, can you tell us why we need to be looking after our pollinators? What do they do for us?
So insect pollination is really important for many of our plants and our crops, which allows them to set seeds and produce fruit. So around the world, about 90% of plant species require some level of insect pollination, and about 75% of our crops require some insect pollination. And closer to home, the value of pollinators to the Scottish economy is estimated to be about £45 million. But as well as pollination, pollinators play lots of different roles in the ecosystem. So they can be recyclers, they can be predators, they can be food for birds and other animals. So they're really important for healthy ecosystems. But in the last 50 years, we've seen a decline in pollinator numbers by about 50%. And that's mainly due to loss of habitat, particularly wildflower meadows. But there's a lot of other factors which are probably playing a part: pollution, pesticides, pests and pathogens, invasive non-native species, and climate change as well.
So Jenni's really well covered all of the important reasons for pollinators. But apart from that, aesthetically, I think they're really wonderful as well. The huge diversity of them, it just makes my heart glad when I see the first pollinators of the year.
Thank you. And yes, it's been great to actually see one of the bees here in the sequoia. Just as we turned up, we saw it flying around. So we know that they're here, despite the slightly dreary day that we've got. There are also some misconceptions about pollinators, which I know all three of you have wee bugbears about. So Rose, what's your bugbear?
Yeah, so I think for a lot of people, when you say the word pollinator, the first thing they think is honeybee, which they certainly are pollinators. They're quite good for some food sources, but there's so many more pollinators out there. Even in terms of bees, they're not the only bee. For example, we have solitary bees and we have bumblebees, and managed bees, honeybees, are actually not really in trouble. The wild pollinators are the species that are in trouble. And I think due to this kind of perception as honeybees being the only pollinators or the main pollinators, people then think about what can they do. And quite often the first thing they think about is setting up a beehive. And that can actually be quite detrimental to our wild pollinators for a range of reasons. So they can outcompete our natural pollinators, and they can also carry pathogens which they can pass on to wild bees as well. What I would say to people is, if they're wanting to do something for biodiversity and for pollinators, think about habitat creation in the first instance. So things that will support our great diversity of wild pollinators.
Abbi, what's your bugbear?
The pure hatred for any weeds, and weeds is a very light term there. So dandelions, for example, a lot of people don't like them, but they're really important for early pollinators that are coming out just after winter, because they're the first flowering plants. And a lot of people want to use dangerous products to get rid of them when they're actually just as easy to remove by hand tools or scraping away. And they're also delicious in salads. So what can you go wrong there?
Indeed, thank you. And Jenni, what's your bugbear?
My bugbear is bee hotels, because actually, as Rose has said, we have lots and lots of species of bee, but bee hotels only support about 3 different groups of bees. And if you have a very big bee hotel, it's going to attract parasites. I would say if you want to have a bee hotel, make sure it's one with just lots of drilled holes, lots of tubes. Avoid ones with pine cones and other bits of plant material, and small is better. And put it in a sunny spot and clean it regularly. Or better still, make your own bug hotel. Just drill some holes into some wood, or create other habitats for pollinators. They like to nest under hedges, in bare soil. So there's lots of other things you can do to create nesting sites for them. As Rose said, there are lots and lots of different types of pollinators. And actually in Scotland, flies are probably more important pollinators than bees. As Rose said, we have lots and lots of different pollinators in Scotland. So we probably have about 6,000 different insect species which have some role in pollination. And that's about half of the total number of insects that we have in Scotland.
I'm now going to throw in no mow as a bugbear, but we'll come back to that shortly. First, if bee hotels are out and dandelions and more love for biodiversity are in, what else can we do to help pollinators? Jenni?
So if you're growing flowers in your garden for pollinators, I would avoid big, showy, double-petalled flowers, because the pollinators can't access them, or if they can, they have very little nectar. You can also provide some water, especially on hot days. A shallow dish with some marbles or stones in it is ideal. You can help to reduce pesticide use by either growing organic in your garden or by buying organic food. And you can volunteer to carry out a bee or butterfly walk, or just spread the word about the importance of pollinators.
Thank you. And interestingly, I have some friends who've inadvertently created a perfect site for ground nesting bees. They dug out a pit in their garden to make a pond and left it to dry out while they were deciding what liner to put in. But they were having a tea break from making a willow fence not far from it a couple of days ago, and noticed that ground nesting bees have started to make a nest in it. So they're going to have to rethink their pond now, potentially digging another hole somewhere else. Anyway, Rose, what are your tips?
Oh, just on that point, Elaine, exactly the same thing happened to me recently when digging our pond. The soil that we had taken out when we were excavating, it has been now made home by some bees, and it's going to have to stay there, I think, until they have moved from the nest, or we may need to rethink where we put our pond.
It must be so lacking bare bits of soil for them to go into.
Yeah.
The minute you create a bit,
build
boom,
and they will come, totally. Yeah. Some other tips that you might want to include, for example, is planting your flowers in blocks. So if you're a pollinator, a group of plants are going to be more attractive than a single flower. So that's something that you could do. Using native plants, native provenance. You can either collect seed yourself and grow your own, which a lot of people do very successfully. It's really rewarding to do that. Or there are a lot of local producers who will sell local provenance. And local provenance is really important because the flowers then are suited to our native. And also having a range of food plants in your garden throughout the year is really, really important. It's not just during the summer when the adults are active. You need to support every stage of the life cycle of pollinators. So grasses for the larvae and habitat to pupate as well. Abbi mentioned about dandelions. I also feel the love for dandelions, and it's really great because they are one of the earliest flowering sources of food. So when queens emerge in the springtime, they're really hungry, and quite often one of the very few plants that are available are dandelions. So that's a really good example of an early flowering plant that is important for pollinators.
So I'd also add that leaving things over the winter as well is really important. So a lot of people would be tidying up their gardens at that point, but a lot of things like dead leaves and stuff like that is really important for food as a food source.
Something I didn't realise until reading David Goulston's Silent Earth was the damage neonicotinoids, a group of insecticides, can do to pollinators and all insects. And while it's been banned here for agricultural use, although derogations have been allowed for several years for sugar beet, these chemicals are still in pet flea treatment, which can then still get into the environment from your pet. Dog goes swimming in the river or something like that, for example. It's a great book for anyone interested in this area and to learn some more about this, and I'd recommend you read it. Next up, Abbi, perhaps you could tell us about some of the things local authorities who look after miles and miles of verges that could be lovely homes for pollinators have been or are planning on doing.
So NESBiP hold a number of events and seminars every year. And in 2019, we actually held a seminar on roadside verges and what local authorities could do or small organisations could do to help that. Phil Sterling from the Butterfly Conservation joined us to tell us about what Dorset County Council are doing. They've been doing some work since 2013. This method is called cut and lift. So essentially, instead of cutting and leaving the leftovers of grass verges behind, they're removing it. The idea of this is because lower soil fertility by letting grass grow is actually better for wildflowers, and it allows the wildflower species to come up, and pollinators are loving it. So since this work that they've been doing in 2013, it's actually helped cut their budget from £927,000 to £650,000. So quite a big saving in their budget. And just thinking of that and thinking about all the roadside verges there's actually 313,000 miles or over 313,000 miles of roadside verges across the UK. Just think about how much land would benefit and how much pollinators would benefit if we were using this cut and lift method. We have 700 species of wildflower that grow on the roadside verges. This is nearly 45% of our total flora. But we've had a 20% drop in this due to the poor management and nutrient pollution. Unfortunately, there are a few downsides to this. So machinery and equipment as a problem, and trainings. So NESBiP this year actually held a seminar on pollinators, and this is where this conversation sort of sparked from, so we can learn more about it and help raise awareness for pollinators. Another output that came from this pollinator seminar in the spring was that people are wanting to learn more about how they can help pollinators. So we are planning to hold future workshops and trainings, show people how they can collect wildflower seeds or talk more about cut and lift, and potentially have a list of people that they can borrow machinery from so they are able to do this sort of work themselves.
Yeah, that was such a great seminar, Abbi, a lot of energy, and it was great to see so many community groups at it. So it was actually held as part of Climate Week North East, organised by NESCAN and with NESBiP. And a lot of the top tips that we've talked about today actually came out of that seminar. So lots of people doing really good things on the ground for pollinators.
We touched on the whole no mow May idea earlier, and there's a good reason behind it, and it's been picked up by a lot of people. We're recording this podcast close to the end of May, so there's probably lots of people itching to get their mowers out if they haven't done so already. There's lots of uncut verges full of flowers around as well, although some have more flowers than others. And of course, while some have been doing this for a long time already, like in Dorset that Abbi talked about, it accidentally also became a thing in lockdown when staff were on furlough. But is not mowing in May enough? Or is this a well-meaning excuse not to mow your lawn? Who wants to step in on this one?
So actually, it's probably more important to wait until autumn, early autumn, to do your cutting. And Phil Sterling does say that timing is key. So it's better to do your cuttings in early autumn and early spring, and then you should be able to leave it for the rest of the year and not have to worry about it.
Is there a caveat to that? So if you've got a lawn that you've been maybe treating as a lawn for a long time and it maybe hasn't got as much wildflowers through it, do you have to lead into that? Or are you just going to grow something that isn't necessarily that good for the pollinators?
So you can, if you have only had a lawn with no other wildflower species, you can remove the top layer of the soil of your lawn to create bare soil, and then you can wildflower seed across this bare soil, and then come spring you should be able to have wildflowers, and then you can recycle your no-mow May into a no-mow year.
And is there a halfway house for that? So some people might not want to completely tear up their lawns. So is there another way you can do it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Some people may not want to have their entire garden given over to sort of a slightly more wild lawn, throughout the summer. And that's absolutely fine. I think the key thing is having a bit of diversity within your garden. So having some patches that are suitable for pollinators, leaving those uncut, as Abby says, right through to the autumn, are absolutely fine. Just make sure that you're still doing your bit.
So there's use of fertilizers as well. People put fertilizers on their grass. What's the tip for that? I can see Rose shaking her head there.
I would strongly discourage the use of fertilizers. There are lots of things that you can do to improve your lawn. A really good tip is the use of yellow rattle, and I've used this myself both in research and in my own garden as well. It's a hemiparasitic plant and it's really good. And what it actually does is reduces the vigorous grasses, so it allows wildflowers to thrive. So maybe look at some natural solutions instead of immediately reaching for the chemical fertilizers.
And also, if you cut in June, what's the risk? So if you're itching to get your lawn cut now, what are the risks of removing some of that nice long grass habitat?
So obviously we've got a lot of birds that are starting to nest, and we'll be having chicks as well now. And so if you remove that grass, then their food source is gone. So it's not just about the pollinators. There'll be other things within the grass. So worms, slugs, tiny little insects that the birds eat and feed to their young. And it's really important that they still have that food source.
Another good thing is maybe just to think about cutting a little less often. So maybe once or twice during the season, if you really want to cut it, rather than every week. A bit of untidiness is actually a really good thing.
So if someone wants to go beyond reducing their mowing, or perhaps wants to turn some community land into a wildflower meadow, what can people do?
Well, you can come to us at NESBiP. We've been helping communities and local organisations for almost 30 years now with native wildflower seeds and import. We also have a NESBiP wildlife gardening group that lots of people share ideas, offer support and help. And we also have our NESBiP Facebook page you can follow too for up-to-date information about our follow-up from this seminar we had held in the spring.
Yeah, that Facebook page and the Wildlife Garden group is really useful. It's my go-to as well, including tips on my new pond. In addition to the support provided by the partnership, NESCAN can also provide quite a lot of support in terms of helping communities source funding for creation and maintenance of their projects. But as well as that, we have a really diverse network of members, and a lot of them are already doing that. So we can help put them in touch and provide that peer-to-peer support that's really important if you're a new group and you want to get something off the ground. So hearing from somebody who's already doing that and has been doing for a number of years can be really useful to a new group.
To give people an idea of a good wildflower habitat, have you each got a suggestion of a nice meadow or wildflower habitat in the area that they could visit?
So I live in Portlethen and I really enjoy the Portlethen Moss. That is the community group there that's been working on creating more wildflower meadows and creating habitat for pollinators. So I recommend going there.
So biodiversity is amazing. And even more amazing is that everybody can do something for biodiversity. And for me, this really highlights about how important individual actions are for pollinators. So you don't have to go somewhere wild to see pollinators. You can literally see them on your doorstep. And some recent research by Mark Goddard from Northumbria University and his colleagues highlighted that gardens and allotments are real hotspots for pollinators. So try doing something in your garden and watch those pollinators come.
Fantastic. Thank you. Jenni?
A place I like to go to watch pollinators, which doesn't have a lot of flowers, but is the banks of the River Dee. So the south-facing banks where you've got sandy, bare soil. If you look very closely, you'll see little exit holes and little mining bees flying around.
So we focus quite a lot on wildflowers, but as mentioned earlier, pollinators play a big role in our food chain too. At the Hutton, this is something we take an interest in. Jenni, could you give us a flavour of some of the work that we've been doing in this space?
So we're doing quite a lot of work on soft fruits, looking at what the best level of pollination is to get the best yields and quality of fruits like cherries and blueberries. We're also working with farmers so that we can help them farm in a more pollinator-friendly way, including if they do need to use pesticides or other chemicals, how they can do that in a way that has the minimum impact on our pollinators. And we're also helping them find ways that they can actually monitor the pollinators on their land for themselves.
We also do some work on pollinators and the things that impact pollinators here in Craigiebuckler. For example, we have a project looking at how bee disease can be spread through microplastics, which is known to harbour pathogens, but bees can inadvertently pick this up and then spread it around the environment, which could impact different colonies. We mentioned neonicotinoids earlier. We've been looking at levels of neonicotinoids in the environment, including in the River Yangtze in China, where they were found at eye-watering levels. But back to pollinators. Finally, last question for you all. What is your favourite pollinator and why?
Oh, I have to say moths are awesome. I absolutely love Lepidoptera butterflies and moths, and some recent research by Max Anderson from Butterfly Conservation. As part of his PhD, he did some really engaging research. I'm actually very envious because it brings together two things that I love, and that's Lepidoptera and camera traps. So Max did some really fantastic research using camera traps that demonstrated that moths are really good pollinators at night time. And another good output from that was that bramble is a really good food plant for pollinators. So again, if you're thinking about, what to include in your garden, bramble, which people consider quite untidy, can be really beneficial for pollinators. So my vote goes to the moths.
Abbi, what's your favourite pollinator?
It's actually really difficult to pick a favourite pollinator. I've been thinking about this for a while, but I really love the hummingbird hawk moth just because they are beautiful to see in their day flying environment, and they spend ages just sitting at one flower, hovering away with their long tongue, and then they move on. Really difficult to get a photograph of though, but they are lovely to watch.
Jenni, what's your favourite pollinator?
I'm going to give a shout out for midges, because without midges we wouldn't have chocolate, because the cocoa plant is pollinated by little non-biting midges.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you to our guests, Rose Toney from NESCAN, Abbi Ferrar from NESBiP, and Dr. Jenni Stockan from the Hutton. Thank you also to you, the listener, for joining us. We hope this episode leaves you fluttering and buzzing to help our pollinators. Do like and share the podcast, and of course, subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice. Just search Hutton Highlights Podcast. Until next time, stay safe.